The session today, so it's the fourth seminar of confinement in French and Francophone literature and film, which we're holding here at the Institute of Modern Languages Research. I'm Joe Ford, I'm a lecturer in French at the Institute, and I'll just say a word about the series, which we first convened back in March, which seems like an awful long time ago, although it's not that long ago. We conceived it because of because of the unique situation that we found ourselves in back in March, although it doesn't seem so novel anymore. We wanted to, I suppose, use that first period of lockdown to think more broadly about the realities and the metaphors of confinement across a whole body of French Francophone literature and film. And some of our speakers have looked at how writers explicitly engage with the practice of confinement as we know it today. But we've also tried to interrogate the other practices and ideas of confinement that existed prior to the COVID-19 crisis, and asking, I suppose, what we can learn about our current moment from focusing more closely on the theme of confinement as it presents itself in literature and film. So that's kind of a little brief bit about the series. I'm absolutely delighted that Polly Gallis from Bristol University has agreed to join us and talk about and share her work today. Polly was recently awarded the Society for French Studies Postdoctoral Prize Fellowship to conduct research at Bristol under the title Narratives of Pleasure and Protest by Francophone Sex Workers. This project examines literature by authors from France, Switzerland, and Algeria from the 1950s to the early 2000s. And Polly completed her PhD in French at the University of Leeds and is now revising her thesis for publication with Peter Lang as a winner of the Young Scholars Competition. And the title of that book is called Frank French Feminisms, Sex, Sexuality, and the Body in the Work of Ernaud, Houston, and Arcan. And she's also co-organizing the next Women in French conference, which is taking place virtually in May 2021. And that's in collaboration with academics at the University of Maynooth in Ireland. And Polly's previous publications include a co-edited special issue for L'Esprit Créateur, which is entitled Challenging Spaces and Gazes, the Body in 20th and 21st Century Francophone Culture, and a co-edited volume with Peter Lang, Querying Bodily Norms in Francophone Culture. So Polly's title today is PLV, I Love You, Albertine Sarrazin's Letters to Julien from Prison. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Polly, who will speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. Thanks, Polly.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks so much for organising this series. It's been a real source of comfort and stimulation during lockdown, and huge thanks to all of you for coming as well, especially during this busy time. And I look forward to your questions at the end. So I will share my screen. Can everyone see that okay? Is that working, Joe?
I can't see your screen, no.
Share.
That's it, yeah. You can see it now.
Perfect. And you can hear and see me okay as well?
Yeah, all good.
Perfect, okay. So as Joe said, I'll be talking about Albertine Sarrazin's Letters to Julien from Prison. Albertine Sarrazin spent almost a third of her brief life behind bars, and her extensive corpus of novels, journals, poems, and letters was written largely from prisons during the 1950s and 60s. Today, I'm going to explore how love letters to husband and fellow convict Julien invariably signed off with such loving flourishes as PLV, pour la vie. I'm interested in the coalescing roles of carceral and romantic letter writing, in how imprisonment and love jointly inform Sarrazin's letters and the experiences and worldviews that she articulates within them. I'll start with a quick biography of Albertine Sarrazin, just for context. Sarrazin was born in Algiers in 1937 and adopted 2 years later by a colonial French couple, moving to Aix-en-Provence in 1947. She received a bourgeois education and excelled in her studies, yet her childhood and teen years were turbulent. She was raped by her uncle at the age of 10 and incarcerated in a reform institute as a teenager under her adoptive father's orders. And that's because from 1804 to 1958 in France, fathers had the legal right to intern their children on the grounds of incorrigibly unruly behavior. Sarrazin ran away to Paris in 1953, turning to sex work to survive, and she staged a bungled hold-up in a shop where her partner in crime accidentally shot one of the vendors. Sarrazin was caught shortly afterwards and sentenced to 7 years in prison, first in Fresnes, then Doullens. Sarrazin escaped over the prison ramparts in 1957, breaking her ankle bone in the process, and was rescued by Julien Sarrazin, for whom she formed an instant attraction. Julien, however, was involved with another woman at the time and remained frustratingly aloof. Sarrazin eventually expressed her feelings for him through a series of letters on the feast day of St. John the Baptist and convinced Julien to commit himself fully to her instead. From the very beginning then, letter writing is a fundamental component of Albertine and Julien's romantic history. They spent the next 6 years in and out of different jails, Boulogne, Amiens, Soissons, Compiègne, Clairvaux, and Nîmes. And with one of the pair invariably behind bars, letter writing became their primary means of communicating as a couple. In 1959, Sarrazin was temporarily released from prison to be wed to Julien in a ceremony that allegedly lasted no more than 10 minutes. They finally settled down together in 1964, but after less than 3 years of free married life, Sarrazin died tragically from a failed kidney operation. Their correspondence from prison is therefore marked with tragic irony and adopts a heavy significance, as the imprint of a fated love story which buds largely between physically divided souls. I'm also interested in the significance of Albertine's letters to Julien from a literary perspective. Sarrazin has been celebrated by critics for her quintessentially hybrid voice that combines poetic language, argot, and an elevated French. As a platform less inhibited by conventions of genre, letter writing provided Sarrazin with a still greater opportunity for aesthetic experimentation. Literary critic Brigitte Duc, for instance, affirms that Sarrazin's bifton de prison authorized all sorts of spontaneous acrobatics, inclusive of the diverse syntax across Albertine Sarrazin's writings. There is evidence of such spontaneous acrobatics in all of Sarrazin's letters to Julien from prison, and I'll consider the broader potential that they afford for creative development, relationship building, critical testimony, and self-realization. I'll begin by examining 2 collections of authorized letters that had to be reviewed, censored, and approved by prison guards before being delivered to either Albertine or Julien. The most recent collection to be published, Amoureuse et Rebelle, brings together letters from 1962 to 1963. It features Sarrazin's love letters to Julien alongside those of actress Arletty and singer Edith Piaf, underscoring Sarrazin's canonical position within 20th century French and feminine culture. This edition is formatted as an attractive copy book and incorporates images of the physical letters themselves, attesting to their visual aesthetic appeal. Of all 3 women's letters, Sarrazin's are indisputably the most polished. Arletty provides hurried though passionate scrawls to Saurin and brief updates written up on a typewriter, and Piaf's are lengthier and more poetic, but include the occasional erasure, whereas Sarrazin's letters are striking in their handcrafted precision. Beyond a natural talent, this is partly because Albertine had more time to devote to letter writing from jail, and also partly because Albertine and Julien were temporarily limited to 1 sheet per letter. Writing as small and as neatly as possible, without blots or corrections, would doubtless have helped Albertine to maximize on the minimal paper allocation. She skillfully adapts to the limited space and follows a set structure in each letter. She incorporates news of her life in prison or from their lawyer or family, before turning to intellectual musings and notes of affection, and ensures that the text fits the space exactly without variation in style or size. This formulaic but nonetheless romantic recipe is headed by illustrations of flowers, the traditional gift between lovers. She mostly draws roses, symbols par excellence of love and romance, or hyacinths, indicative of sincerity and constancy. She even refers to herself as Julien's rosière, his rosebush, a close homophone of rosaire, rosary, inferring that these love letters provide a form of salvation behind bars. Pictures also contribute to a sense of domestic comfort in prison. Sarrazin is forbidden from gluing pictures of flowers to the walls and must content herself with copying the images onto paper. Letter writing thus provides a limited space for creative homemaking, which is unavailable within the physical space of the cell itself. In these images, we can also observe prison official stamps and signatures, approving delivery or reminding inmates about forbidden forms of correspondence, a paratextual reminder of the contingencies of letter writing in prison. The Amoureuse et Rebelle collection thus provides vivid evidence of the shape, appearance, and policing of Albertine's letters to Julien, as well as proof of her letters' attractiveness from a material and visual point of view. The most extensive collection of authorized letters is seen in Lettres à Julien, counting over 500 pages. Despite restricted access to stamps and paper then, Albertine and Julien succeeded in amassing an impressive correspondence between their fortnightly visits to the parloir, the visits rooms. Both lovers relish receiving and reading one another's letters, though they must adapt the content and tone to be acceptable to reviewing authorities. Albertine reminds Julien, for instance, to adhere to a proper French. This volume also provides us with the most extensive example of Sarrazin's epistolary literary experiments. These range from novelistic prose, as she sets the scene for her reader with such opening phrases as calmly under a lamp, to nonsensical paronomatia and automatic writing, reminiscent of the surrealist activities, such as, "It's so good to jolt. Sorry, to wreak havoc? Blimey. It's definitely chaos, we say, though, no?" Albertine ruminates on her broader writing practice too, thinking ahead to edits for Le Times' Journal de Prison, 1959. Albertine loves letters from prison thus equate to a self-reflexive aesthetic as well as romantic exercise, of which Julien is keenly aware. At one point, Julien is deprived of Albertine's letters, and he implores the authorities to relent because, he explains, "It's a way for my wife to get me out of prison, to make me live near her. It's a mark of love and also an exercise in style, I think." Julien is therefore conscious of the value of letters, love letters specifically, for Albertine as his wife, who relies on letters to feel closer to him, and as a writer, who relies on letters to relay and develop her authorial voice. This collection is unique in containing segments of letters from Julien himself, and we can discern clear overlaps in his and Albertine's content and style. Julien employs similarly multilingual expression and cryptic language, as seen when he asks her, "You'll be here quando?" said the ancestor. He also employs similar analogies. Julien refers to a violin with over-taut strings, to which Albertine responds, "Let's break the string or let it relax, relax, until it can play a deeper octave. Let's relax together, my love. It's a melody without listeners. The hour of pizzicati will come again." So they literally string together words and images to establish romantic harmony. Julien proves himself to be an eloquent letter writer in his own right, with Albertine complimenting his so-called impressionist style, and one of her acquaintances asks permission to borrow one of Julien's metaphors, inferring his literary talents. Letter writing therefore enables Albertine and Julien to connect and hone their creative capacities. The literary dimension of their letters also enables them to draw together as a couple. The automatism in Sarrazin's letters, for one, which we saw an example of earlier, creates a sense of immediacy and thus proximity within the epistolary text, since Julien can read Albertine's thoughts as they happened, not as a delayed narration of past events or ideas. Streams of consciousness permit a more visceral presence within the written text, enabling Albertine and Julien to draw a clearer picture of their other half, to establish what the sender thought or felt at the time of writing. This recalls the view of epistolarity theorist Liz Stanley that letters stand in for the absent letter writer to some extent. Stanley asserts that a letter exists because of the absence of the writer and the distance, literal or figurative, between them and the addressee. But the materiality and the meaning of letters also conjure up something of the being of the writer. And in doing so, letters have similar effects concerning the relationship between the correspondents. They signify the relationship itself. In a more recent essay, Stanley and Margareta Jolly similarly refer to the fetishizability of letters as traces of another's presence. This fetishization of letters becomes acutely apparent within Prison, in which traces of the writer or addressee stand in for that whole person. This embodied way of writing is substantiated by Sarrazin's illustrations in Amoureuse et Rebelle, which, she explains, take shape in tandem with her whirling thoughts. I quote, "Here's the reason for my labyrinth-like bouquet. It acted as a background to my reflections, you know, my quill passing and repassing automatically at the paper's corner." Doodles thus provide an imprint of unconscious physical actions enacted during a thinking process, the perfect marker of a cerebral come physical motion. This allows for an embodied and hence more intimate form of communication that strengthens the already material quality of the epistolary form. It's for similar reasons that Albertine enjoys reading books recommended by Julien, so that she can picture what he was thinking at the time, and which, in her words, kind of doubles my perception. And I'm sure many of us will have experienced something similar in recent months, a similar sense of comfort and connection through shared reading, as virtual book clubs become a small way of remaining remotely connected to colleagues and friends. Within Albertine and Julien's love letters from prison, then, creative development works concurrently with relationship building. The same is true for a certain scholarly dimension to their letters. The range of their intellectual references is impressive, including Sartre, Apollinaire, Pascal, Descartes, Bergson, and Diogenes, and each lover has their specialisms, Rimbaud for Albertine and Plato's Gorgias for Julien. They thus become a woman and man of letters in both senses of the word, and Albertine declares proudly that talking about our health or the weather isn't for us. She caps this all off by signing off letters with Tibi, inspired from the ancient Greek for to you. I can sympathize with Sarrazin's efforts to produce letters of a higher intellectual order, since letters are her primary means of communicating with Julien in prison, and hence representing her mental traits as opposed to physical ones becomes considerably more important. Indeed, when inspiration fails and her pen dries up, Sarrazin bemoans the fact that we remain hopelessly defined by what others see of us. Since Albertine and Julien are prevented from exchanging oral conversations of length, the written word adopts a disproportionately superior value and subjects their liaising lovers to significantly more pressure. Julien is acutely conscious of Albertine's subsequent anxieties in her letters as she strives to construct an image of intellectual brilliance, and he encourages her to put her letters to more banal use, insisting that, "I'd like it if you told me what clothes you need. Tissues, stockings, anything. Don't be daft," as the other one said. "Write to me about these little things. It'd make me happy to fetch such trifles." So their correspondence is largely composed of conversations about literature, philosophy, art, love, life, and similarly highbrow topics. Yet with Julien's encouragement, they exchange information of a more trivial nature that seems to be equally essential to them growing as a couple. They enjoy sharing everyday facts about each other, including their weight and measurements, and favourite words. They also take time to catch up on family news, to lament their inept lawyer, and to paint a picture of their surrounding environments to draw still closer together. Through these last references to settings, we discover a great deal about French prison conditions of the 1950s and 60s. We learn that Albertine had access to music, a sewing machine affectionately named Cornélie, a loudspeaker, and a collection of cacti to care for. She also exercised regularly, attended mass, and worked in an atelier alongside 70 men. Yet Sarrazin complains about certain privations and mistreatment. She describes the excessive cold in winter and stifling heat in summer, spiders at her feet and perpetual chills, asking Julien to disinfect his notepads before writing to her again. Elsewhere, she condemns the incarceration of an elderly gentleman, and she equates the uncertainty of awaiting judicial review to being dunked repeatedly underwater. These letters would have been reviewed by guards first, and there is thus an ulterior motive to such criticisms. They allow Sarrazin to vent her frustrations while reprimanding the authorities for their neglect. Sarrazin specialist Jacques Layani highlights provocative quips of a different kind in the Amoureuse et Rebelle collection. Albertine confesses to fancying the incumbent priest and even alludes to a sexual escapade intramuros between her and Julien, writing, "While we made a few touchdowns in 1961, from 1962 I can only recall smooth underwear, and a few rare but enjoyable fumbles. The most recent one in the visits room yesterday. Shh, and let us never forget it." Albertine therefore reaps pleasure from tongue-in-cheek references that posit authorities as both the reviewer and unexpecting recipient of her self-conscious and eroticized narration, and she thereby dances on the edge of discovery and flirtatiously flouts systems of discipline. There's a distinct irony deployed through Sarrazin's existential musings too, that undermine the expected purpose of incarceration. On the one hand, Albertine and Julien's letters reveal that they are desperate to be reunited beyond bars, and time runs unbearably slowly. On the other hand, Albertine recognizes that periods of incarceration, devoid of distractions, provide a unique opportunity for meaningful reflection, asserting that it's actually great to think of the clink as a simple setting devoid of distractions that allows you to reflect on life's essential questions, something even a desert island or monastery can't allow for. Towards the end of their prison sentences in particular, Albertine and Julien begin to invite time in, to quote Walter Benjamin, and lost time in prison is therefore reconceptualized as time gained. Julien contemplates nature and Albertine rests, smokes and savors books, careful not to finish any too quickly. Above all, she takes stock of her past and future and reaches an ultimate state of amor fati and what she terms her non mea culpa. She resolves that past mistakes led her to Julien and were therefore necessary, and that their suffering is a blessing, suggesting that there'll always be something wounded about us that might niggle from time to time. I think, mind you, that that's a privilege. She's not overly optimistic about the future then, and refuses to believe in a long life of unfettered bliss, but she never loses sight of the end goal of being reunited in a calm life. The notion of penal incarceration being a time for reflection is therefore turned on its head. Not once in her letters to Julien from prison, authorized or otherwise, does Albertine convey remorse for the crimes she committed, and these crimes in themselves are only ever referenced indirectly. Instead, Sarrazin utilizes this space and time of reflective confinement, or rather confined reflection, to reconcile herself with her past and look towards a realistic but happy future. Sarrazin's love letters to Julien thus demonstrate her brazen honesty as she forges epistolary narratives of acceptance rather than repentance, in the knowledge that these will be reviewed by prison authorities. Now I want to come to a collection of Albertine's clandestine letters to Julien, letters that bypassed authorization by prison personnel. Sarrazin's bifton de prison, notes from prison, consist in secret notes which Albertine and Julien smuggled to one another between 1958 and 1964, mostly from the female and male sections of Soissons prison. They concealed their missives inside canteen litter, such as lemons, empty mustard pots, and chocolate wrappers. This practice is cinematically visualized by Michel Mitrany in the 1971 film La Cavale, based on Sarrazin's novel of the same name, and alluded to intertextually amongst Sarrazin's lettres à Julien. In those letters, Albertine and Julien continually discuss what food they've eaten that week, namely carrots, cake, and chips, and Albertine christens herself Madame la Frite, Mrs. Chip, hinting at their clandestine activity. The couple agreed to burn these biftons after reading them, presumably lest they be discovered by the authorities. Yet this collection exists today, or at least a third of it, because Julien stowed a sample in his underpants as he exited prison. So these letters are smuggled twice over, both within prison and outside of it. Julien possessed many authorized letters from Albertine, which he could reread without risk of recrimination. Yet I sympathize with his decision to retain and indeed publish these specific letters. Their clandestine nature allows for an exchange of more intimate thoughts and feelings, and they contain some of Albertine's deepest existential and romantic musings, complete poems, and her funniest and most provocative tales. Firstly, the illicit content and form of the bifton provides Albertine with much-needed emotional release and creative stimulation. As tensions escalate over cleaning duties and queues for the showers, for example, Albertine writes, "Woe betide whoever gets on my nerves today." Within the bifton, Albertine can indulge in scribbled threats with no risk of retribution from prison guards as a minimal form of release within a claustrophobic environment. The ultimate form of release lies in the exchange of the bifton itself, and it seems the idea of living on the edge of discovery, relentlessly, is a positively thrilling one for Albertine. She reaps great pleasure from duping the guards, who suspect that there is misconduct afoot but cannot pinpoint exactly what that might be, and from implementing strategies to allay their suspicion. Examples include following a routine and gaining their trust by showering them in smiles, good wishes, and thanks. Albertine's audacity reaches its peak when she concocts an escape plan with Julien under the code name Arara and draws up maps of the prison floors, impeccably preserved in this publication. Ultimately, this project falls flat, yet it provides the couple with much-needed dreamscapes and diversion. Albertine wonders proudly whether their adventure might be one of a kind, and she deems one Saturday miraculous because somewhere Piaf is playing, secondly, the weather's good, thirdly, in 2 months from today, you know, and finally, he, Master S, has arrived. The implied prospect of escape brightens her days in prison, as do the sound of Piaf's voice, the sunshine, and a visit from her lawyer. The concept of evasion to which the bifton gives flesh is therefore equally, if not more important and significant than the event in itself. The emotional benefits of an imagined escape are powerfully conveyed in the third stanza of one of Sarrazin's bifton poems. And I haven't got time to read this out loud today, but I've got it here on the PowerPoint in case anyone wants to go back to it at the end. So the stanzas in bold specifically evoke a sense of softness, la douceur, that stems from the bird's flight. The concept of escape is therefore a soothing one and a meaningful source of poetic inspiration. It should also be noted that other poems were taken away by her lawyer for safekeeping, that Albertine refuses a request to make copies of poems for her warden, and that complete poems of this kind are rarer within Albertine's authorized letters to Julien. Albertine is therefore clearly more comfortable sending poems via secret letters. To summarize so far then, the biftons provide a space for furtive imaginings which are both emotionally stabilizing and creatively stimulating. As for what the Bifton afford to Albertine and Julien as a couple, while Albertine and Julien grow largely on an intellectual and creative plane in their censored correspondence, Sarrazin's Bifton present much greater opportunity for connecting physically. As Albertine explains, and to read you, it's indescribable, the clandestine notes especially. Certain words truly give me a sense of contact with you. It makes me shake for a moment from my hair to my toes. Albertine also specifies that if I've always hated talking while having sex, it seems to me that in here, writing dirty things amounts to doing dirty things. Albertine and Julien's clandestine notes are therefore precious because they enable a sense of tactile encounter from afar, especially sexual contact, and Albertine finds a use for dirty talk to which she is ordinarily disinclined. Albertine also finds creative and entertaining ways to titillate Julien. She toys with the idea of sending him a sketch of her anatomy and describes her pubic hair to him, which she's recently shaved into the shape of a heart. So she says, I've trimmed my pubes in the shape of a corazon, which is Spanish for heart. It's original. And this way I can brag that my ass won't look like anyone else's. The polyglot language play and grammatical inaccuracies here complement Albertine's girlish invention and reinforce the freedom of expression that these secret messages permit. The use of Spanish is especially significant because foreign languages were forbidden within official carceral correspondence. Sarrazin's Bifton, by contrast, brim with multilingual phrases, combining French with broken English, Spanish, and Italian, partly perhaps as an additional means of complicating and hence coding her messages to Julien, but mostly for the sheer fun of experimenting with newly learnt vocabulary and of incorporating this into her literary repertoire. The clandestine character of these Biftons, after all, make them the perfect space for unfettered creative play and experimentation. Much more so even than her personal journal produced at this time, Le Times, which was always intended for publication. Sarrazin thus takes advantage of these notes' secrecy to show Julien a different, bolder, and more mischievous side of herself. This provides us with a glimpse of sexually transgressive pastimes in prison. Albertine divulges her lesbian tendencies to Julien and confesses that, I can assure you that a lot of girls don't know how to pleasure themselves. Half a page, no more, to the point that I often have to draw them a verbal diagram. The parenthetic phrase here preempts Julien's discomfort, and Albertine's persistent narration stresses the importance of these memories to her and demonstrates that she aims for complete openness in her love letters to Julien, as opposed to empty flattery or meaningless expression, contrary to Roland Barthes' definition of the quintessential lettre d'amour in Fragment d'un discours amoureux, that maintains that a love letter has no tactical value, it is only expressive or, at a stretch, flattering. Albertine also recounts how female convicts in a former institution collectively covered the prison walls in their menstrual blood. Nothing pleases me more than listening to my blood flow. There was even a little game in vogue within the blocks at Fresnes, which consisted in stuffing it, inserting your 10 fingers carefully, one after the other, until you had fists à la Villette of rubies. You then had to stick your hands to the white wall, then wash your hands, start again, and so on, until the whole cell was decorated. You can imagine the scandal once the door opened. The word Villette alludes to the Parc de la Villette in Paris, I assume, formerly the site of a giant abattoir, to paint a pretty gruesome picture of the bloody mess being made. I imagine that letters containing such stories might have been refused by prison officials, and that it is the clandestine nature of the Bifton that allows Sarrazin to share such tales with Julien, and by which we, as the unintended secondary readers, can access such remarkable stories from French prisons of the time, of female prisoners sharing homoerotic relationships and masturbation tips, and having a riotous good time resisting order and decorum. What's more, these stories are not simply recounted for the sake of arousing or shocking Julien, but because they form a part of Albertine's history and identity. as Albertine confirms, "I don't have many memories that aren't about sex." These stories are therefore important for Julien to learn, however reluctantly, if he is truly to understand the woman with whom he has chosen to build a future. In contrast to these jocular topics and tone, Sarrazin recalls a time when she contemplated suicide and was brought back from the brink by the prospect of a life with Julien. She relays that she remembers something compelling, inescapable, that told me, "Look, little head, and understand that this is your most beautiful chance because it's your last. And so as not to lose you, or rather, so as not to lose myself, I chose the narrow path." Albertine therefore admits to depending on Julien as her fundamental raison d'être. It's worth noting that Sarrazin embarks on a similar theme in an authorized letter of 1962, writing, "I chose to live again," but stops herself in her tracks with, "My darling, let's not talk about this anymore. I'm writing a stupid letter." Presumably, the prospect of guards reviewing her letters makes her self-conscious, while the privacy of the bifton enables her to discuss her previous suicidal thoughts without interruption and to expand on the deeper and darker aspects of her feelings for Julien. Albertine then invites Julien to decide where he stands and to make himself equally vulnerable. She proclaims, "You've been as stubborn and as proud as me. Now push yourself a little, will you? I'm échec et pat." I meant to write pat, it's not a mistake. The term pat recalls her injured ankle that she refers to in the bifton as her paw of nails, pat à clous, a metonymic reminder of the moment she escaped from Doulan prison and was rescued by Julien. By referring to her injured ankle, Sarrazin emphasizes her past and present sense of dependence, and that she has played her last available hand. The passion in Albertine's speech and the cleverness of the closing wordplay shows her to be a competitive match against any love rival, and hence cements the value of letter writing for relationship building within prison walls. This also recalls the fact that Julien chooses to commit to Albertine only once he has read her letters to him on the feast day of St. John the Baptist. In fact, we learn from Lettres Julien that Julien reread these letters once he was released from prison in 1960, which reflects these letters' enduring power. It's also significant that Julien shares one of Annie's letters with Albertine, aka those of La Polaque, Albertine's love rival. And this finally convinces Albertine of Julien's undivided affection for her. And so she writes, "Thanks for Annie's letter. I can see the type of girl she is now. Thanks for sharing that with me. Now I'm completely settled. I'm done with being in pain, I promise." By exposing Annie's letter in this way, Julien betrays Annie's trust and proves his unreserved commitment to Albertine instead. Albertine's response also reinforces the importance of letter writing for revealing the character of a person, thanks to which she now recognizes the type of female rival she's contending with and realizes with satisfaction that Annie represents no serious threat. To conclude, Albertine's letters to Julien from prison provide exceptional opportunity for literary and artistic development, with Albertine in particular honing a polyvocal and multi-generic writing style that encompasses tangential streams of consciousness, snippets of foreign languages, complete poems, and philosophical aphorisms. Their carceral love letters also enable them to connect as a couple creatively, intellectually, pragmatically, sensually, and emotionally. The fact that prison authorities reviewed and censored the letters collated in Amoureuse et Rebelle and Lettres à Julien lends an ironic and satirical dimension to Sarrazin's critique of prison conditions and to her conceptualization of incarceration as time gained, not lost, and as a period of self-acceptance rather than guilt or repentance. The secrecy of Sarrazin's bifton provides her with mental diversion, emotional escape, and creative stimulus, and they enable Albertine and Julien to stimulate physical contact and to simulate sensual arousal from afar. The bifton likewise provide room for inventive anecdotes about sex and the body, through which we learn about illicit forms of pleasure and resistance in prison, not least the thrill of sending the bifton themselves. Finally, Sarrazin takes advantage of these clandestine letters to open up to Julien on a deeper level and to strengthen existing romantic bonds. There are limitations to Sarrazin's letters to Julien, chief among them being the considerable risk of misunderstandings that the written word occasions. And I'm sure we can sympathise as citizens of the digital world with many miscommunications that can occur via text or email or WhatsApp or Messenger. And Sarrazin likewise alludes to the prospect of prison guards specifically misinterpreting her jokes and consigning her letters to the waste paper basket. Some stories or thoughts are also too long or unwieldy to convey via letters, such as a childhood memory that Sarrazin cuts short and chooses to tell Julien face-to-face at a later date. And she explains that she prefers to express her personal reflections in person or in journals. Towards the end of the Lettres à Julien collection, so in the winter of 1960, Sarrazin loses patience with letter writing altogether and suggests that she and Julien preserve their energy until their eventual reunion, proposing, let's save our energy for the future. For the most part, however, Albertine's love letters to Julien succeed in making their time apart and in jail more bearable, and much more besides. Albertine uses her letters to develop as a writer, to reduce the sense of distance between herself and Julien, to vent her angst as a prisoner, and to either pass time or capitalise on time in confinement to evaluate her approach to life and love. Overall, her carceral and romantic letter writing provides an invaluable platform for creative development, relationship building, critical testimony, and self-realisation. And that's all from me, and I'll leave you with a fittingly festive picture of Albertine and Julien decorating their Christmas tree.
Thank you very much, Polly. A virtual round of applause for Polly. That was for an amazing paper and really fascinating story about Albertine Sarrazin and the letters. Perhaps I'll let people gather their thoughts for a second.
Do I need to stop sharing the screen, sorry, or just...
That would be great, Polly, yeah, thank you. Unless you wanted to leave up the image. Yeah. It's up to you. You can always come back and share your screen during the Q&A if you need to. Just to remind people that the chat is open, so if you'd like to ask a question, then please you can either raise your hand or you can write in the chat, and then I can ask you to unmute yourselves and ask your question, or you can ask your question in the chat and I can read it out on your behalf. That's absolutely fine, whatever you prefer. Perhaps I'll kick us off, Polly. It's a fascinating story, and I don't know much about, and I'm intrigued by the history or story of the publication of these letters, and particularly the relationship between literary writing and the letters. And I wondered, could you say a bit more about how these letters came to be published? I thought you mentioned that Julien published them after her death. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Thank you so much for your question. Yes, so they were all published posthumously, and that was on Julien's request. So the first and the publishers were the same as the publishers for her main novels and stories, so Pauvert editions in Paris. And they first published her official correspondence, so the correspondence from prison that would have been reviewed by prison guards. And then there were letters published to her readers, sent to her readers, sorry, and so to fans and to her publishers, which were also published as a separate collection called Lettres de la vie littéraire. So those were mostly from her later life, 1965 to 1967. So when she's freed from prison and editing her literary works. So yes, one collection is the Lettres Julien collection, which was offered by Julien. The Lettres de la vie littéraire was composed of letters sent in from all sorts of different people, from readers to publishers. And the Bifton de Prison were published 10 years after the anniversary of her death, so much later than the other letters. And I think that's allegedly because Julien felt more uncomfortable sharing the Bifton de Prison with the world because they were supposed to be private. So the letters sent to him from prison, as one critic, Josiane Duranteau, notes in the introduction of Lettres à Julien, were always intended to be read by a third party. So there's a sense that Julien wouldn't have felt morally restricted from sharing those letters publicly, because Albertine always intended to share them, for them to be read by somebody else anyway. But there was a bit more of a moral dilemma with the Bifton, especially as I hope I convey today. They contain a lot more intimate information, and Albertine presents herself in a very different side of herself. But ultimately, Julien thought that that was important for readers to truly get a sense of the real Albertine, and it seemed fitting given that it was a decade after her death.
Lovely, thanks, Polly. So I've got a question in the chat and then a hand up I can see. So can I go to the chat first? I've got Pauline, who's asked a question about translation into English. Pauline, would you like to ask a question? Perhaps not. The question is Sarrazin translated into English, Polly?
The only work that I know of that's been translated into English is her most famous novel, L'Astragale, so Astragalus, and that has that's a new edition has been released of that as well, with a preface by Patti Smith. Oh. But I'm not aware of any of her other works being translated as of yet, no.
Great, thanks, Polly. And then Maria, I can see your hand is up.
Hi, really enjoyed your presentation, Polly. And it's really great to see so many familiar faces from French studies. I've missed all of you now that I'm in the world of media and communication, which is much more dry. So Polly, you can probably guess actually what my question is going to be about.
Is it about the menstruation scene?
So I just want to, well, I have so many questions about it, but I'll stick to like maybe one. So you're kind of framing it in terms of sex when you were talking, and is it clear kind of in the letter what her kind of intentions were by including that scene? Was it meant to be kind of sexual, or was it kind of more like a maybe early kind of second wave feminist celebration of femininity? Like, how is it framed?
Okay, thanks for your question. And yeah, I thought that might come up. Yeah, sorry, I didn't make it clear, because it doesn't really fit into either of those frames, either a kind of second wave feminist or sexual framework, really. I think I included it alongside references to sexual experience, just to kind of collectively talk about transgressive elements within the Bifton about the body. But the menstruation scene definitely isn't sexual. And I think the intent is definitely not to arouse Julien or to represent herself sexually to him. And, you know, I think she knows as well that she's being provocative, and you know, as when she's describing the masturbation scenes, I think she knows that she's pushing boundaries, and she's doing it more because she enjoys telling the story more than for his entertainment. As for the feminist aspect to it, I think it's difficult to read a lot of what Sarrazin writes from a feminist perspective. I don't think she has, or even from a political perspective, I think a lot of her work is, you know, she always wants to write about her own personal thoughts and experiences, but I don't think she has any aims to disrupt, you know, structures of power, or, and when I think she acts in this very disruptive way, I think she does it purely for the pleasure of misbehaving. I think, you know, she just enjoys going against, yeah, the status quo, or forms of confinement or oppression, but I don't think it's necessarily a political or feminist move, or at least not a deliberately feminist move. And I think there are a lot of cases where menstruation is used as a form of protest in prisons, especially in terms of, for instance, contesting conditions of sanitation in prisons. And I know things like the No Wash campaign, where prisoners have, deliberately not washed or used their menstruation to as a form of protest. But I don't think that's the case in Sarrazin's work. I think it seems more that it's just a form of release, and just for the sheer fun of creating havoc, really. Maybe a sense of feminism in the sense of like a sense of women's community through indiscipline, maybe.
Thanks so much, Maria, for your question.
Bye.
And thanks, Polly. It's interesting. There is another question in the chat, which I'll put you, Polly. I just wanted to mention, related to that question of the politicization of the protest, and your mention of Diogenes before, and it just made me think of, a question about cynicism, and whether, is that a kind of political mode? And maybe that's a broader question. If you did say that Sarrazin was interested in Diogenes, did you not?
She doesn't really develop too much on his work. I think the ones she talks about the most, I don't think I mentioned Camus, but she talks a lot about Camus and Nietzsche. So there's a lot of focus on nihilism and amor fati, and more so than Diogenes's work.
It's just something that struck me.
Really. I think that she does, but I suppose she does adopt a cynical approach, even if she doesn't refer to Diogenes specifically. Because especially in the sense that because she grew up in a very repressive, in a very bourgeois household as well, and she writes in other works about feeling a certain level of hypocrisy within her family and social environment that she grew up in, because it was very conservative and very restricted, but then obviously she experienced abuse within that environment, and she found out about her adoption, and they revoked their adoption rights while she was in prison as well. So she feels, I suppose, a real sense of resistance to everything that kind of society represents, which would include systems of discipline, and so hence I guess why a sense of cynicism emerges.
Thanks, Polly. So there's a question in the chat which hasn't been posted, but the person has sent it directly to me. I don't know if that's intentional or by mistake, but I don't know if Rita would like to ask her question, then you're very welcome to unmute yourself. If not, I can read it for you. I'll read the question. So you mentioned Albertine's regular attendance at Mass in prison. Did this reflect a deep faith rather than her looking for a change of scene from her cell? And did Julien share her faith?
Okay, thanks for your question, Rita. She did attend Mass regularly, and she was also very much involved in an active way. So she used to sing in Mass, and she chose what songs would be sung, and and was an avid attender. And she also really wanted to have a religious wedding ceremony, and she was prevented from doing so because the priest said that in order for it to be a religious ceremony, they would have to be able to consummate the wedding after the ceremony, which they couldn't do because Albertine was still in prison at the time. So she was released for about 10 minutes, I think, just for the duration of the ceremony, and then had to be imprisoned again. So for her it was really important, and sadly she couldn't have a religious ceremony and it had to be a civil one. But she wasn't, I don't think she had a faith in God as such, or at least not a traditional religious belief. I think she just had a sense of nostalgia for religious traditions and convention, but there's no sense of a faith in God as such. And when Rita talked about a change of scene from her cell, I think she really perceived that in the sense of her having a kind of idyllic life with Julien outside of prison. I don't think, and achieving a sense of accepting oneself and one's past and looking towards a happy future. But I don't think that's ever envisaged in a religious sense. Her penchant for religious tradition is more of a nostalgic thing, perhaps for a sense of comfort in prison as well.
Thanks, Polly, and thanks Rita for your question. Question from Di. Do you want to ask your question, Di?
Okay, can you hear me, Polly?
Yeah.
So I just wondered about Julien. Do the letters provide a sense of why Julien is the object of love? I'm interested in whether the letters kind of construct the Julien that she wants, or whether you get a sense that there is something, that there are certain things in Julien that provoke her desire or her love.
Thanks, Diana. She does talk, I mean, the main elements that come across about Julien as being a really desirable love object are his good looks. So it seems like she doesn't make any bones about the fact that she's quite shallow. She says, I don't understand people who say looks aren't important. They really are. And she talks about sharing photos of him with the wardens and fellow inmates, and she's very proud of him in that sense. She also talks a lot about his intellectual abilities, and she likes the fact that they can have very deep, meaningful conversations. I think there's also a sense of him being the kind of inaccessible love object to start with. So she was the one who was always after him in the beginning. When they first met, she fell from the prison walls and she had a broken bone, and he rescued her and he looked after his family home, and then took her to a series of safe houses. So she was very much dependent on him. And so I guess that really made her want to, she was constantly striving to be independent in order to be good enough for him. So I guess in that sense, she's kind of built him up as a love object in her head, because she associates her love for him with self-improvement as well, and as a form of success, I guess. But yeah, so beyond, so there's physical good looks, intellectual brilliance, a sense of excitement as well, and there's that she says that they have similar outlooks in life. So similar outlooks in life, and sorry, someone got their music on, or is that just me?
I don't know. It's not here.
So also I think the other attraction is that she says that they have quite similar approaches to life and similar trajectories. So she likes the fact that they both have a criminal past, and kind of have this really complicated but exciting love story. Other times I don't quite see the appeal really, and I feel like perhaps it's more the distance and the fact that they can't be together that makes him more exciting as a love object, maybe. And there's a lot of kind of girlish naivety in a lot of her letters, where she says, they're going to spend the rest of their lives together, and so on. And I wonder whether So a lot of the time she's not talking about specific traits about Julien, but about her love for him in a very general sense. In a very so it could be a love letter to anyone a lot of the time, I think, really.
It gives a shape to her solitude and to her writing as well.
Yes.
Thanks.
Sorry, that was a very confident answer. But in short, there are definitely things which are attractive about him. But I think also the idea of Julien is just as exciting as the man himself, maybe.
Thanks, Di, and thanks, Polly. Claire has a question. Claire Lozier. Can you unmute yourself, Claire?
Yeah. Hi, I just did. Hey, thanks, Polly, for this really interesting indeed insight into Albertine's universe in general. And I have a question about the way she signs her letters, especially the first one you showed us, because I had the impression, briefly, looking at your screen, that the letters were actually signed Annick Sarrazin.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that.
I mean, great that, then we can maybe develop on that a little bit as well, because I was just wondering, basically, why does she sign those letters, those early letters with this different name? And whether it has any bearing in terms of identity, authorship, signature, the meaning she wants to give to her letters, whether she wants to pass any specific message to Julien by doing that. So the meaning of it in terms of her literary project and maybe in terms of her relationship as well.
Perfect, thanks, Claire. And sorry, yes, I said Albertine Sarrazin just to avoid confusion. And just to simplify matters, but she had multiple names that she used throughout her life. So she was born as, when she was first born, she was abandoned and taken in by, I suppose, the equivalent to social services. And she was named Albertine Damien because she was found on the day of the Saint Day of Damien, I think. So she was Albertine Damien, and then she got, when she was adopted, she became Anne-Marie Renaud, I think. Then when she went into the institute in Marseille as a teenager, she was nicknamed Annick, because I think there was another Anne. Then when she worked as a sex worker in Paris, she took the name Annika. Okay. Then when she went into prison, it was Annick again. And then she became Albertine Damien again when her parents revoked their adoption rights. And then when she married Julien, she became Albertine Sarrazin. And she wanted to take his name because she said, not as a matter of course, because she was a woman, but she said that she really wanted to be rid of that name, a surname that was associated with her family history. So she chose to go with Albertine Sarrazin for her publications as well.
Okay, so all of her publications are under one name only?
Yeah, in Albertine Sarrazin. But then, in prison, she sometimes refers to herself as Annick. And then her autofictional novels also have different names as well. So some are Anne, Al, Annick.
Okay. And it's interesting in terms of literary writing as well, the fact of using heteronyms and whether it has a bearing on what you write, how it's written, whether you adopt different style according to the name you choose. But that makes her even more fascinating and complex as a character, therefore.
Adopting different personas.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Claire. Thanks, Polly. There's a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see it. I think you should be able to see it, from Julie Rogers. And Julie is saying she can't come on the microphone because she's looking after her 6-year-old. But she says, I'm interested in the epistolary form as genre, the immediacy of the writing, but also the immediacy of the reading. A very unique writing, but also a unique reading experience. Is there anything to say about the shaping of a genre that emerges from the letters, about the shaping of the genre, I suppose, of the epistolary genre that emerges from these letters?
Oh, thank you, Julie, and thank you for attending the talk while babysitting. Yeah, real commitment. Thank you. I would say, first of all, about the immediacy of reading is that, well, first of all, the bifton couldn't be read straight away, so there's lots of waiting in between letters, and in prison as well. Sometimes Julien or Albertine would send 3 or 4 letters to one of them before they received the letter back from the other one, because of differences in terms of what they were allowed to send and receive. So that complicates, that's complicated in that sense, especially from an editorial perspective, in terms of how do you set those letters out for readers to read? Do you put them in the order that they were received, or so there's that element. Also, there's the fact that letters weren't only read by Albertine and Julien, but there's a sense within their letters that they also read them out to fellow inmates. For instance, when somebody says, oh, can I borrow that metaphor that Julien used, because it was really beautiful, so then they reuse it for one of their love letters to somebody outside of prison. So there's a sense that it's, obviously there's also the third party reader of the prison officials reviewing the letters, but beyond that, they're also, these letters aren't supposed to be intimate and private in any sense. They're, they both appreciate that they're going to be read and form a part of entertainment for other cellmates as well. So they're fairly public. As for what that means in terms of genre, that's, I guess each collection has its own character. So the bifton maybe is more of an experimental ground, whereas maybe Lettres Julien and Amoureuse et Rebelle have a bigger shape to them. Maybe they're almost journalist, like a journal form, maybe almost similar to the journal genre, because that's where she kind of develops her existential ideas or philosophical musings. And bifton are letters in a more traditional sense. I don't think any of them fit into any neat category. And Liz Stanley, again, who's the epistolary expert I mentioned, she talks about how the epistolary form, by definition, can't fit into a generic category. So sorry, I would say that, I don't think the epistolary form can fit any genre, but if I had to pick, I would say that Lettres Julien are probably closer to the journal genre. Maybe. Does that help, Julie?
She says thank you in the chat, so I assume yes. Thanks, Polly. There's another question here from Victoria, who's saying thank you for such an amazing introduction to Sarrazin's work and her feminine female heteroglossia. This question, Victoria is just asking us, could you tell us how and where she fits in your broader project? Victoria is curious about how you situate her alongside other writers, as the circumstances of her writing and her genre seem so unique and so transgressive.
Oh, thank you so much, Victoria. That's a really great question. Thanks. About how does it fit in with the wider project and why is she so unique and transgressive? I would say the other writers I'm looking at are writing from the 1950s through to the early 2000s. Another one of them, Griselide d'Israël, writes letters as well, and some are from prison as well, and are sometimes quite transgressive in content in terms of drawing attention to prison conditions and that sort of thing. And they're also fairly transgressive in terms of erotic narration and so on. I would say what marks Sarrazin's letters as being particularly transgressive is that she's writing in the 1950s and 60s, which is a time when, I mean, in the early and mid 20th century, you have a lot of male criminal writers who are being lauded for their writing, such as Jean Genet, whereas female criminal writers were considered to be, well, their works didn't receive good critical reception at the time, and they're only, that type style of writing by women is only being receiving lots of critical attention today. And so I suppose while Griselda Disrael's works were also transgressive, she was writing them mostly in the 90s and early 2000s, and well, sorry, also in the 60s and later on, but I guess yeah, Réal's were at a later date, Sarrazin's, and Sarrazin's haven't received, sorry, I'll rephrase that. Réal was writing from 1960 through to the early 2000s, which means she's received lots of critical attention today. And I think Sarrazin still needs lots of critical attention, because when she was writing works by female criminals would not have been received as well. And they would have been really transgressive at the time. And so, yeah, that's why I think it's really worthwhile reading them today. And I don't know of any other female criminal writers who were writing in this way at the time. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Polly. That's great. And just to well, thank you for all your responses. If people have, if there's one final question, then we can take it. But if not, I mean, I just wanted to, yeah, to thank all of you for coming, and to, I think there's one question I've got. Is it Owen? Can you unmute yourself? You need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you. You're muted.
You can hear me now.
We can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Golly, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Polly, and everybody else. I'm just asking, to what extent did the writer get high on writing? Because to some extent you're saying that some of her letters were read by all her mates and so on and so forth, but they would also be monitored, surely, by the prison authorities. What sort of a kick did she get out of writing? Or is that too obvious a question? Did you hear it?
Yeah, I did. Thank you so much. And no, yeah, no, that's a perfect question. Thank you so much. And yeah, I definitely do think she gets high on having her letters read by other people. I think that's definitely why, you know, a lot of her letters are really provocative, even those which she knows are going to be reviewed and censored. And she kind of plays she tries to push the boundaries as far as she can. And perhaps she also gets a certain pleasure as well from writing in a particularly creative way, in the knowledge that that's then going to be read by other people. But it's interesting because then some of her most creative work comes about in her bifton, which are the secret notes. So you think, well, in that case, there's a sense that she really does get pleasure just from writing for the sake of writing, and yeah, and not just for the kick that she would get from a wider public reading it, but just genuinely for sharing her how she's feeling with Julien. So yeah, I definitely think there's a certain thrill she gets and pleasure from being read.
Kind of clandestinity, yeah.
But, yeah, but then other times I really think that it, you know, that she just wants to share how she's feeling with Julien, and it doesn't really go beyond that. So I think it depends on the circumstances.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Also, sorry, I just wanted to pick up on Victoria's point again, because I feel like I kind of waffled at the end and didn't give a very coherent response. But I think I just wanted to talk about differences in genre to give a bit of context as well. So talking about it in the wider project, but also in terms of Sarrazin's broader corpus as well, which is just to say that today I've been talking about her letters, which are obviously very transgressive in content and style, but I think the same is true for a lot of her published works at the time, so her journals and novels, and they were really transgressive at the time, to the extent that the prison authorities at the time weren't very happy with La Cavale, for instance, being published, because it revealed too much about prison conditions at the time, and about illicit behavior as well. So not only was she transgressive in being a female criminal, but in writing about criminal activities as well. I think, you know, she was really transgressive, not just in her letters, which are private, but also in her published works. And she said that before her publications, she doesn't think that anybody really published a very realistic work about prison life. So her works are very transgressive in their realist quality as well. Hope that's, yeah.
Hello. Thank you for a wonderful paper and very informative. I just wanted to observe that she was barely 30 when she died, and she was spectacularly productive and spectacularly unlucky in such a short life. And I agree with what you say about her not being necessarily a theoretical feminist or theorizing her politics. She was a rebel from the start, and you can understand why, given the circumstances of her birth and upbringing and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she was definitely a rebellious and very productive writer as a woman, and therefore very important to be read as a woman writer, but also from a feminist perspective as well. I guess and I think that's particularly important now, when it seems like there's I guess a renewed zest for bad girls in post 2000s. So, and I think that's why her literature is being revisited, especially now. But I guess I was just trying to say that I don't think that as a writer she is particularly interested in pushing a feminist agenda. So she's very productive as a writer, and I think what she writes about is very, in being transgressive, so in writing about, for instance, intimate women's experiences, or in talking about her criminal experiences as a woman, she is de facto performing a feminist act. And it's very important to read her works within the context of feminist literature. But I don't think that that's her intention when she's writing. I don't think she intends to write in order to push forward a particular feminist ideology. But that doesn't mean that we can't read it as a feminist text today. Hope that helps a bit.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your question. Thank you for brilliant answers, Polly. Really fantastic paper as well. And I suppose if there are no more questions, I mean, I just have one question, if I may. And it's you probably answer it very quickly, which is, did she ever write about her birth in Algeria? Did she ever write about that, or anything to do with the circumstance? I mean, talking about Algeria specifically, perhaps the circumstance of her birth in Algeria.
Yeah, well, she talks a lot about kind of wanting to go back to her roots, and she talks about wanting to learn her mother tongue, for instance, so her real mother's tongue. But there's definitely a sense that, I mean, she definitely considers herself French in a lot of ways. And when she does talk about other Algerian inmates, for instance, she talks about them being othered in a lot of ways because of their race and identity. And she doesn't there's never any reference to herself being othered because of her race. So she's very much considered as a French citizen. The only time she is recognised as Algerian, it's more of a positive thing, and only very rarely.
So that's very interesting. So do we don't know who her parents were, presumably?
No, there's an biography by Jacques Layani, who suggests that, well, there's an indication that we know who the mother is. She was Spanish originally, and her father, Jacques Layani, presumes that is her adoptive father is her real father, and that adopting her was a way to kind of accept his responsibility, but without having to. But that's pure. That's, there is good reasons for arriving at that speculation, but it is speculation nonetheless. So it's hard to know what her origins were exactly.
Okay, no, well, great. Thank you again, Polly, for such a fascinating paper, and thank you all for your questions, and thank you for coming. And I hope that I'm just brilliant to see everyone, and I hope it's been a useful session for you as well, Polly.
Yeah, it has been. Also, sorry, I think I said mother tongue, but she actually says father tongue. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not entirely clear on her heritage, Catalog, but I shall look further into it. And thank you for your question.
No, so shall I. It's a fascinating. She's a fascinating figure, and I know a lot more. I've learned a lot today. So thank you, Polly.
Thanks for having me to come.
Yeah, thank you also. Virtual round of applause, although, of course, and hopefully we can see each other in person very soon. But thank you very much, and have a lovely evening.
You too. Thank you so much to everyone for coming.
Bye, everyone.